Bishop Helen-Ann, you were the first and so far only bishop to call for the Archbishop of Canterbury to resign. Why are you a lone voice?
I was motivated to call for the Archbishop's resignation, firstly because anybody reading the Macon report would be rightly horrified by its contents and the role of senior clergy in covering up the abuse. And I was also motivated by the letter that I received previous to the publication of the review from both archbishops, which I think spoke deeply to the culture of power and control in the church. And I thought I would be joined by colleagues who I knew privately were discerning that it was probably the right thing for the Archbishop to resign. And I think it's a great disappointment to me that when I called for that publicly, I was indeed a lone voice. So I have no real explanation for that, other than there is a culture, I think, of silence and fear amongst the bishops, which is really unhealthy.
What are they afraid of?
I think that silence speaks in many ways. Some are silent perhaps because they see themselves as succeeding to be the new Archbishop of Canterbury. Others are fearful of being reprimanded and rebuked, because I know that colleagues have received letters similar to mine which are quite heavy in tone. So I think genuinely they're motivated by a fear of just keeping their heads down and not feeling able to speak out, which I think is really unfortunate. And this current situation has really blown the lid on that and many other aspects of unhealthy culture.
Well, let's unpack some of that. I mean, first of all, what you seem to be saying to me is that this is a senior hierarchy, if you like, infected by straightforward careerism. That people won't do what they should do because they're looking forward to the next job. Is that right?
I think there will be some thinking like that, unfortunately, and I mean, I know that from informal conversations with colleagues. I think others are just used to keeping their heads down and getting on with the job at hand, which is fair enough, but there are times when a prophetic voice is needed and we do have to stand up. And I think also fear and silence can be complicit with some unhealthy theologies that I think are at the heart of church life over many decades, which tend to problematise things like gender and sexuality and ethnicity, and all of that is in the mix at the moment. And as I said, Macon has really blown the lid off a lot of that dysfunction.
I want to come to the point about your letter, but you've said that this weekend is Safeguarding Sunday. You quoted in one of your messages the book of Proverbs, which says that Christians are enjoined to speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves. Are you saying that many of your colleagues essentially are not fulfilling their Christian duty?
I think my colleagues do a really fantastic job at the local level. And let's face it, being a bishop or being a leader in public life is challenging and not easy at times. I think it's really deeply ironic that Safeguarding Sunday has a theme of let's talk about it, which is precisely what the church tries to do, but I think doesn't do well enough. And sometimes we can be held back by fear, and that fear leads to silence when we can say things in private and then not vocalise that in public. And that's, for me, that's disappointing.
Do you think that silence is a signal that the church's hierarchy, aside from people's own personal interests, may be placing the church's own reputation above or ahead of the suffering of those who were abused by John Smyth and indeed others like him?
Well, the Macon Review indeed has shone a light on the horrendous abuse perpetrated by John Smyth and the way in which the church, particularly people in senior posts, covered that up, allowed the abuse to continue and did not intervene at a point when that abuse could have stopped. And I think that has exposed the church's continual failings to victims and survivors. And in a sense, what we've seen, or what I've seen and heard in the last few days, is a kind of re-traumatising of those victims and survivors because the church hierarchy has failed to act in the way it should have done. And so the reputational risk is immense, both looking out into the world, some of the messages I've had from people in public life and in civic positions of leadership, but also I think more critically the reputational impact looking in on clergy who work incredibly hard in parishes, parish safeguarding officers. Their morale has really been impacted seriously, both by the Macon Review and the response to it in the past few days. And so that reputational risk, I think, is critical at this time.
You referred to the letter that you received from the Archbishop of Canterbury and Archbishop of York, which I think we don't need to get into the details of it, but asked you essentially to not to do certain things. But the point is that you made about the tone of it, that it was coercive. I just want to ask you, how high is this culture of fear, of careerism and so on that you're talking about? How high in the church does that go?
I've heard anecdotally that a number of my colleagues have received letters that are similar in tone, and I can only speak from my own experience in terms of how I read the letter and how it impacted me. It felt like it was coercive language. And I don't know any further than that, other than to say how it impacted me. But I suspect that this is not the first time that such a letter has been written. And the tone of it has been such that it represents, I think, an unhealthy use of power and control. I mean, the fact that the letter addresses me by my first name, I don't have a problem with that, but it's signed by both archbishops using their full titles. And a number of the phrases used in the letter, I think it was deliberately written so as to coerce me into a particular view that is one that I would want to challenge in that regard.
When you looked at the Macon report, you will have seen, like everybody else, that there were others mentioned who would be, if I can use the word, culpable in a similar way to the Archbishop of Canterbury. Do you want further resignations to follow?
I think anybody who's named in the report who is shown to have failed in the highest standards expected in response to abuse and reporting of abuse, anybody named in the report who still occupies public office or a role in the national church, I think they ought to step down, yes.
So you would call for further resignations?
Yes, on the grounds that the Archbishop of Canterbury has resigned. And I do think that there is a question about what resignation actually means in that regard. I think if any clergy person in my diocese had been shown to have committed serious safeguarding errors, I would have either expected them to or asked them to step down immediately. It is not clear currently what status the Archbishop of Canterbury has.
The position of the Church of England has to some extent been, I guess, damaged by this episode. The bishops will once again be in the spotlight soon, but as the House of Commons enters debate about the issue of assisted dying, will you personally support or oppose the proposed legislation to allow for assisted dying?
So I've gone on record for some time now as being opposed to assisted dying, and in this case it is physician-assisted suicide. For a number of years I was a bishop in New Zealand where they were debating that issue, which was resolved by referendum, and I worked in the context of being a bishop there to oppose that legislation, and I would do so here again if it were to reach the House of Lords. I would continue to speak against it, largely because I don't think the assurances around safeguarding are watertight. I think it's very difficult to assess whether somebody can be seen as being coerced into agreeing to end their own life. I think it's difficult to assess whether somebody has up to 6 months left. Sometimes people live much longer than that. I think what we need is a better investment in palliative care, and we also need to not try and legislate for something like this through a private member's bill, which has minimal debate and minimal scrutiny. It's not the way to do it.
So to be clear, your opposition is in a sense pragmatic rather than fundamental. You would say that were conditions right, this is something that might be contemplated, rather than resting entirely on, I guess, what one might call the sixth commandment opposition, thou shalt not kill.
I should say I'm very firmly opposed to any attempt to introduce either physician-assisted suicide or voluntary euthanasia, or however you want to call it. I'm very opposed to it. I think there are two issues here. One is the principled response to the bill, and the other is the mechanism by which is the best way to have a debate. I'm absolutely up for a debate, and I think that's the right of Parliament to have that debate. But I personally don't feel that a private member's bill is the safest mechanism to have that debate. But in any circumstance, I would not support any move to that at all.
Let me just ask you lastly, if I may, the issue may, as you say, come to the House of Lords. And of course, there's a group of bishops who are in the House of Lords as of right. I suppose the question that many might be asking this morning is, why is it that a group of people who represent what is now a minority interest in England and Wales continue to have such a privileged place in our lawmaking? Is it time for the bishops, the Lords Spiritual, essentially to go the way of hereditary peers who've now been removed from the House of Lords?
Well, speaking as one of those 26 Lords Spiritual, I can only speak from my experience, in the sense of I received a writ of summons to become a member of the House of Lords as a Lord Spiritual, and I had to respond to that. And I seek to use that role to the best of my ability to speak into critical issues of the day, particularly through the context, the geographical context of which I'm a bishop, the northeast of England. And my sense from those both inside and outside of the parliamentary context is that the bishops are considered to have a valued and valuable voice. We're not whipped in any way. We have to retire at 70. So these are some of the aspects of reform that may be introduced into the House. And I think it's not for me to decide whether bishops are or are not in the House of Lords. That's for the House to determine. But as I see it, and as I sit in the House, I can only see value that I seek to add to any debate and discussion. And I myself value that opportunity.
Bishop Helen-Ann, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
We approached the Church of England for a response to the allegations in that interview. They didn't have anything to add. A spokesperson for the Archbishop of York said this: "The Archbishop is saddened that his letter is being described as coercive. This was not his intention, nor did he mean to cause any distress to the Bishop of Newcastle. The Archbishop of York continues to be committed to further independence for safeguarding within the Church of England, the independent scrutiny of safeguarding, and a much better victim-centred and trauma-informed approach to the culture of safeguarding within the Church of England."